Today, a new president is inaugurated. Perhaps you're outraged that this clearly illegitimate charlatan has rigged the election somehow. Or perhaps you accept that this is the people's legitimate choice and you are furious at them for their collective stupidity and lack of moral fortitude. Alternatively, maybe you are relieved that the nation's salvation has been assured, or at least that the lesser of two evils prevailed. Regardless, democracy is on your mind. This seems a most appropriate time to insist upon one of this channel's central messages. Democracy is illegitimate. It is not a question of this or that candidate, who has citizenship or who won the popular vote. It is not a question of what kind of system of democracy you have. Parliamentary or presidential, proportional representation, or first past the post. It doesn't matter if our democracy is direct or representative. It is all illegitimate. What is legitimacy? Let me put it very simply. Government makes laws and issues commands. Governments are legitimate when there is a moral necessity for you to follow those laws and commands. To reiterate, government is legitimate when you have to obey the laws it produces, not just out of fear of punishment, but because those laws have a moral force of their own. Governments must be legitimate. If legitimacy were not essential, if we only comply with government's dictates for fear of punishment, then governments would be justified in instituting the most totalitarian controls. If they did not believe that their subjects would obey because they essentially believe it right to do so, the only possible way to rule would be through draconian coercive control. Democracy cannot produce legitimate government. Confining ourselves for the moment to liberal democracy, majorities cannot produce moral force. If a thing is wrong, a majority saying otherwise cannot make it right. Rather, all that will be achieved is the multiplication of error. What is missed by most is that liberal democracy, in theory, is not supposed to operate by the tyranny of the majority. It is pretty obvious that a majority, or in most cases a measly plurality, of people saying a rule should be followed cannot in itself be a reason to follow said rule. Were pre-civil rights Black Americans morally obliged to their second-class status because a majority of whites thought this should be so? What about antebellum black slaves? Most Americans at one point felt chattel slavery to be justified. Were runaway slaves in the wrong? Of course, this is not how democracy operates. What is more absurd than this kind of crude majoritarianism is how liberal democracy is actually supposed to function. In theory, see Locke's second treatise, the act of voting entails an implied consent on the part of any losing minority or majority to the eventual outcome of the process. Plainly, this means that whatever the outcome of a vote, you consent to it, even if this is not what you wanted. This is what is meant by the oft-repeated claim that democracy is rule by the consent of the governed. To illustrate, think of a small group deciding to take a vote, come to a decision. By consenting to take the vote, you are implicitly agreeing to the outcome. Out of the process of individual voting, a single will is produced. This is what is called the will of the people. It is this will that is continually being invoked by politicians and activists. Ruling in conformity with this will that integrates both the votes for and against into a unitary will, is how liberal democracies are supposed to be legitimate. This is what is meant by the familiar formula, democracy is self-rule. This system is as nonsensical as it sounds. You have probably been on the losing side of an election or referendum more than once. Do you feel like you consented to the outcome? Does it seem reasonable that the outcome represents your will? Moreover, are you willing to accept the responsibility for the outcomes of the decisions you voted against? If liberal democracy represents the will of the people, indeed, if there even is such a thing as the people, then you should be prepared to do just this. If not, then democracy is not legitimate, and there is no reason why you should feel bound to obey decisions reached by the democratic process. Contrary to the example of a small group reaching a decision by majority vote given above, you do not consent to the liberal democratic process. Even if you don't vote, your consent to the outcome is assumed and you are expected to see the consequent government as legitimate. The fact is, democracy is illegitimate. There is no such thing as the people that demands your obedience, only a plurality of individuals, and there is no reason why you should submit to the majority if the majority is in error. I've qualified my comments on democracy so far as applying to liberal democracy. This is because the modern alternatives, those alternatives which Churchill so famously said have been tried from time to time, are not alternatives to democracy, but alternative forms of democracy. Both communism and fascism claimed to represent the will of the people, albeit with different conceptions of what constitutes the people. What they have in common is that they both claim legitimacy on the basis of this figment of the imagination and are, consequently, illegitimate. Democracies may well produce good outcomes from time to time. Communists defeated fascism in Europe, abolished foot binding in China, and industrialized the Soviet Union, if indeed we regard this latter accomplishment as a good. Fascists suppressed the mafia, banned smoking in public places, introduced laws against animal cruelty, and, as we are so often here, made the trains run on time. Liberalism has probably produced more discrete good outcomes than communism and fascism combined. But all of this is besides the point. Whatever good a democracy may have produced did so illegitimately. The outcome of this or that policy may have been contingently beneficial, but the process that produced it was fundamentally illegitimate. What was done was the right thing, but the people doing it had no right to. This isn't an unfamiliar concept. Think of vigilantism. The punishment dealt out by the vigilante may be well deserved, but the vigilante is not the person legitimately empowered to deliver this punishment. This is what I urge you to think about as you mull over the inauguration today. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi. Links in the description.